July 12, 2005, 11:47 p.m. It was one of those quiet summer nights when the world felt like it was holding its breath. The news had been filled with stories of a record-breaking heat wave sweeping the country. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't just the heat, it was the stillness. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights at the gas station where I worked the graveyard shift. The gas station sat alone on an empty stretch of highway. No houses, no towns, just woods on either side and the occasional car that sped by without stopping. That night, the mist rolled in thick, curling along the edges of the parking lot like it was alive. It clung to the ground, swirling under the buzzing lights that flickered every now and then. I remember the moment it all began. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine, trying to stay awake. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. It was my third cup of the night. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. Tires screeching somewhere far off. It wasn't close enough to see, but it was enough to make me pause. A few minutes later, I heard something else. The softest tap against the window. Not loud, not insistent, just enough to send a chill up my spine. I looked up and that's when I saw it. A pale figure standing just outside the glass. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring. I froze. My hands started to shake, and my breath came out in short bursts. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was confusion, unease. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a customer who needed gas. But then the figure tilted its head, and the fluorescent lights flickered again. I'll never forget that moment. I never thought a quiet night shift could turn into my worst nightmare. But this was no ordinary customer. My name's Jake. I'm a college student, or at least I was back then. Working nights at the gas station wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My routine was simple. Clock in at 10, sip terrible coffee, restock shelves, and wait for the sun to come up. Most nights were quiet. A car or two might roll in, someone would grab a soda or fill their tank, and then they'd be gone. This gas station wasn't just in the middle of nowhere, it was nowhere. Surrounded by thick woods, it felt like the edge of the world. The road outside was empty most of the time, especially at night. There were no streetlights, no houses, just darkness stretching out in every direction. The only sounds I ever heard were the ones inside. The ticking of the clock above the counter, the faint hum of the freezer in the back, and the occasional buzz of the overhead lights. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, like it hadn't changed in decades. That night started like any other. I was stacking bags of chips on the shelf when I noticed the lights flicker for the first time. I didn't think much of it. The wiring in the place was old, and the lights flickered all the time. But then I heard something strange. A car horn, faint and distant. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a car on the highway miles away. But even as I shrugged it off, there was this feeling in the back of my mind, this tiny voice whispering that something wasn't right. The rest of the evening was normal, mostly. I went back to the counter, grabbed my magazine, and poured another cup of coffee. But every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing at the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't until almost midnight that I noticed it again. The lights flickered, and the mist outside seemed thicker than before. I leaned forward, squinting through the glass. That's when I saw the faint outline of someone standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then they stepped closer, and I realized this wasn't just a shadow. My stomach dropped, and my hands gripped the edge of the counter. This was real, and it was only the beginning. By the time the clock hit 2 a.m., I was fighting to keep my eyes open. The magazine I'd been flipping through was long forgotten, and I was sitting behind the counter with my chin propped up on my hand, staring at the clock. It was one of those stretches where time seemed to drag on forever. The silence was thick, broken only by the buzz of the lights and the occasional hum of the freezer in the back. That's when I saw headlights cutting through the mist. A car pulled into the lot, and I sat up straight, rubbing my face to wake myself up. At first, I couldn't make out much through the fog, but as it got closer, I noticed it was an older car. Something you don't see often anymore. It was a classic, maybe from the 1970s. A shiny black body with chrome details that gleamed under the flickering gas station lights. It looked pristine, like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, but it felt out of place, like it didn't belong in this time. The car rolled to a stop next to one of the pumps, and for a moment nothing happened. The engine turned off and the lights dimmed. I waited, watching, but no one got out. The seconds stretched on, and I started to feel that familiar unease creeping up my spine. Finally, the door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, his skin pale and almost waxy under the harsh lights. His features were sharp, and his movements were slow, too slow. He wore a brown jacket and slacks that looked old-fashioned, like they hadn't been in style for decades. He didn't look at me as he walked toward the door. His head stayed low, his shoulders slightly hunched, and his footsteps were almost soundless. When he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. It felt colder somehow, like the temperature had dropped just from him being there. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound casual. My voice felt too loud in the quiet room. He didn't respond. He didn't even glance at me. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it on the counter. "Pump 2?" I asked, hoping to get something out of him. He nodded, just once. No words, no expression. His hand lingered on the counter for a moment before he turned and walked back out. As soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands felt clammy, and my heart was beating faster than it should have been. I shook it off. It was late, and maybe the guy was just tired or shy. Plenty of people don't feel like talking when they're on long road trips. I watched him walk back to his car, his steps just as slow and deliberate as before. He stopped by the pump, and I waited for him to grab the nozzle and start filling up. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood there. His back was to me at first, but after a few moments, he turned his head slightly, enough for me to see his profile. Then he turned fully, facing the store. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, staring straight at the window. My skin prickled. I tried to focus on anything else, sorting the coins in the register, wiping down the counter, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. He was still there, completely still, with his hands at his sides. It was like he was waiting for something. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was checking his phone or thinking about something. People do weird things when they're tired. But the longer he stood there, the harder it was to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Finally, after what felt like forever, he moved. He walked back to his car, got in, and drove off without pumping any gas. The taillights disappeared into the mist, and just like that, he was gone. I sat there, staring out the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't add up. Why would someone pay for gas and not pump it? Why had he been staring like that? The air inside the gas station still felt cold, like it had soaked up whatever strange energy he brought in with him. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just a weird encounter with a traveler passing through. But deep down, I knew something was off, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. I don't know what came over me, but sitting behind the counter and pretending like nothing had happened just wasn't cutting it anymore. The silence felt too heavy, like the gas station itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the image of that man. His pale face, his slow movements, the way he stared through the window like he was looking straight into me. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe I was just trying to convince myself that I wasn't scared. Either way, I stood up, grabbed my flashlight from under the counter, and told myself I was going to figure this out. It had to be a prank. Someone messing with me. Maybe a bored local or a traveler with a weird sense of humor. I took a deep breath, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me, and the clock ticked on the wall, marking every second I hesitated. Finally, I turned the knob and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me immediately, and the mist seemed thicker than ever. It clung to the ground like a low-hanging cloud, swirling around my feet as I walked. The lot was empty. No car, no man, nothing but the faint hum of the gas pumps. I shined the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the fog. I checked behind the pumps, the dumpster, even the side of the building, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. Not even the chirp of a cricket or the rustle of leaves. Just silence. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my brain was playing tricks on me. I turned to head back inside, shaking my head and muttering to myself about how ridiculous I was being. But as I reached the door, I stopped. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze in place. There he was, the man, standing directly in front of the window. He was facing me now, his pale face illuminated by the dim light from inside the gas station. His expression hadn't changed, blank, empty, like a doll's face. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react to the fact that I was standing there just a few feet away. Couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. He hadn't been there a second ago. I'd just been inside, looking out that same window. How had he gotten there? The lights inside the gas station flickered suddenly, and the buzzing sound grew louder, almost like a swarm of bees. Then, one by one, the lights dimmed until they were barely glowing. I heard the clock stop ticking. The gas station that had been so filled with small, comforting noises just minutes ago was now completely still. The silence wasn't normal, it was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. My feet felt heavy, and my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stand there, staring at him as he stared back at me. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. He didn't wave or gesture. He just pointed. His arm moved with an unnatural stiffness, like a puppet on strings. His finger aimed directly at me, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Not emotion exactly, but something darker, something cold. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My mouth was dry, and I couldn't form any words. The flashlight slipped from my hand and hit the ground with a dull thud, but I didn't even notice. I stumbled back, my legs finally moving, but they felt weak and shaky. I tripped over the edge of the curb and fell hard onto the pavement. The mist curled around me, and the cold seeped through my clothes as I scrambled to get up. When I looked back at the window, he was gone. The lights inside flickered again, coming back to life one by one. The humming sound of the gas station returned, along with the ticking of the clock. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I saw. I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the lock. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, and tried to calm down, but the fear wouldn't go away. I had no idea who or what that man was, but I knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done with me yet. The silence in the gas station felt heavier than ever, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I stood frozen behind the counter, gripping the flashlight like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My eyes darted to the window where the man had been just moments ago, but the mist outside revealed nothing. I told myself to calm down, to breathe. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My head snapped toward it, and there he was. He was back, standing outside the window again, just as still as before. My chest tightened. I had just been at the door. He wasn't there. How was he back already? I blinked, and he was gone. My heart raced as I spun around, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it. A faint creak coming from inside the store. Slowly, I turned, the flashlight shaking in my hand. At the far end of the aisle, between the chips and the bottled sodas, he stood. The pale man with the waxy face, his expression still blank and his posture unnervingly stiff. He wasn't moving, just standing there, but the sight of him inside the store made my blood run cold. How did you get in here?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if he were studying me. I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. That's when the lights flickered violently, and the buzzing overhead grew louder and louder, like an angry swarm of bees trapped in the room. The sound became deafening, and then, one by one, the bulbs shattered. Glass rained down from above, and I ducked, covering my head with my arms. The store plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the freezer in the back. Before I could catch my breath, the shelves around me started shaking. One by one, they tipped over, sending bags of chips, bottles of soda, and boxes of snacks crashing to the floor. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of destruction. The cash register slammed open and shut, over and over, the metallic clang echoing through the store. The freezer doors swung open, and a blast of icy air rushed out, cutting through the suffocating heat of the night. I clutched the counter, my knuckles white, as my eyes darted around the room. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It was as if the gas station had come alive, turning against me. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but it grew louder, and soon it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, trying to find the source, but there was no one there. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who's there? What do you want?" The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I turned back toward the aisle where I had last seen the man, but he was gone. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. I ran to the door, desperate to get out. My hands fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, pounded on the glass, and even kicked it, but it was like the door had fused with the frame. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy for the polished floor. I turned around, my back pressed against the door, and there he was again. He stood in the middle of the store now, his head lowered, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Couldn't look away. His movements were subtle, deliberate, like he was acting out a scene. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, just as he had earlier. He stepped toward the counter, moving with that same unnatural stiffness. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together what I was seeing. It was like he was stuck, reliving the same moment over and over. He placed the bill on the counter, but this time his head turned toward me. His blank expression shifted slightly, just enough for me to see the faintest trace of something. Pain, desperation, and then it hit me. This wasn't just random. He wasn't just trying to scare me. He was searching for something or someone. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through me. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent store. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Stay away from me." But he didn't stop. As he moved, his body seemed to shift, his movements becoming jerkier, almost mechanical. He wasn't alive. He couldn't be. I tripped over one of the fallen shelves, landing hard on my back. Pain shot through my arm, but I barely felt it. He was getting closer now, his gaze locked on me. "Please," I begged, crawling backward. "What do you want?" But he didn't answer. He raised his hand again, pointing directly at me, and for the first time I understood. He wasn't just haunting this place. He was trapped here, caught in the final moments of his life, and now he was looking for someone to take his place. I couldn't move. My back was pressed against the cold, sticky floor, and my flashlight lay somewhere out of reach. The man's eyes, those empty, lifeless eyes, were locked on me, and his hand was still raised, pointing as if he was calling me out, singling me out. Then he lunged. It wasn't fast. It wasn't sudden. It was deliberate, like every movement was part of a script. His legs dragged, his shoulders stiff, but he was coming straight for me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. "No! Stay back!" I screamed, trying to crawl away, but it was useless. He reached me, bending down, his pale hand stretching out as if to grab me. But just as his fingers were about to touch my arm, something happened. I wasn't in the gas station anymore. I was somewhere else. Flames surrounded me, roaring so loud they drowned out every other sound. The heat was suffocating, choking the air out of my lungs. I looked around, disoriented, and saw the mangled wreckage of a car. The black paint was charred, and the front end was crumpled like an accordion. Smoke poured out from under the hood, mixing with the fire. And then I heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling, gut-wrenching screams. I turned and saw him, the man. He was in the driver's seat, trapped behind the wheel. His pale, waxy skin was now burned and blistered. His mouth was open in agony, his voice tearing through the chaos around us. He pounded on the window, his hands leaving streaks of blood on the glass as he fought to get out. I tried to move toward him, to help him, but my legs felt like they were stuck in cement. "Help me!" His voice cut through the roar of the flames, but I couldn't. I couldn't do anything. Suddenly, the vision shifted. I was back in the gas station, lying on the floor, gasping for air. The man was standing over me, his expression somehow even more desperate than before. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a faint whisper escaped, soft, broken, and pleading. That's when it hit me. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was trapped. This place, this gas station, it had become his prison. Every night, he relived his death, searching for someone, anyone, who could understand his pain. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I tried to think. He wasn't going to stop. Not until I did something. Then I remembered. The wallet. It was still on the counter, right where he'd left it when he handed me the $20 earlier in the night. I bolted to the counter, my heart racing, and snatched it up. The leather was old and cracked, the edges worn from years of use. I opened it with trembling fingers and found a faded photo tucked inside. It was a family photo. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stood next to two young boys, their arms wrapped around each other. They were all beaming at the camera, the kind of smiles that only come from love and happiness. And there he was, standing next to them, the man, younger, healthier, and alive. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. This was who he was. This was what he'd lost. I placed the photo on the counter, my hands shaking as I gently smoothed it out. "You can rest now," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It's okay. You don't have to stay here anymore." The room went still. The lights, which had been flickering wildly all night, steadied. The buzzing stopped. The oppressive silence lifted. I looked up and saw him standing on the other side of the counter, his eyes fixed on the photo. For the first time, his expression changed. The blank, emotionless mask melted away, replaced by something softer. Sadness. Relief. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the edge of the photo. And then, just like that, he began to fade. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was quiet, peaceful, like a candle burning out. His figure grew fainter and fainter until there was nothing left but the faint smell of smoke and the hum of the gas station's lights. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, the photo still sitting on the counter. The gas station felt normal again, as if the nightmare had never happened. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt, and I knew that whoever he was, wherever he had gone, he was finally at peace. The gas station felt different now. The lights buzzed faintly, the clock ticked steadily on the wall, and the hum of the freezer had returned. Everything looked the same as it had before that man arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place itself had changed. Or maybe it was just me. I stood behind the counter, staring at the photo still lying there. The smiles on their faces, the happiness frozen in that single moment, made my chest ache. I didn't know who they were or how they'd ended up tied to this place, but I felt a strange kind of peace knowing that, somehow, I had helped him move on. Still, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I glanced at the window, my stomach tightened, half expecting to see his pale figure standing there again. I couldn't get his face out of my mind. The empty eyes, the stiffness of his movements, the raw pain I'd seen in that final moment before he faded away. I tried to clean up the store, the fallen shelves, the shattered glass, the scattered snacks. It felt like if I could just put everything back in order, I might be able to convince myself that nothing had really happened. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't shake the chill that clung to the air. When the sun finally began to rise, spilling weak rays of light through the windows, I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. By the time the day shift clerk walked in, I had already decided. I couldn't do another night in that place. "You okay?" she asked, looking around at the mess. "Rough night." I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I'd spent the night with a ghost? That I'd seen things no one would believe? I just nodded and muttered something about not feeling well before grabbing my bag and leaving without another word. That was the last time I set foot in that gas station. The next day, I quit. The manager wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I couldn't explain what had happened, and even if I could, no one would believe me. It was easier to walk away and leave it all behind. But even as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. The man's face, the flames, the photo on the counter. It was burned into my memory. I kept telling myself that it was over, that he was gone, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Months later, the gas station hired someone new to cover the night shift. He was young, probably just out of high school, and eager to make some extra cash. His first night on the job was uneventful, quiet, just like mine had been when I first started. He stocked shelves, sipped coffee, and read magazines to pass the time. Around 2 a.m., as he leaned back in his chair and stretched, he heard it. The faint sound of tires crunching on gravel. He looked up, surprised to see a pair of headlights cutting through the mist outside. A car rolled into the lot and parked by the pumps. The new clerk stood up, peering out the window. The car was an older model, shiny and pristine, but it seemed strange, almost like it didn't belong. He watched as the driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. The young clerk hesitated, a strange feeling settling in his chest as the man walked toward the door.